Hello, welcome to Jacobin's Stay at Home Political Education Series here on YouTube. I'm Jacobin Deputy Editor Micah Utrecht. Before people are fully on, we'll let people stream on, give you a few minutes. You maybe know the drill by now if you're watching this, but we've been doing this political education series, several dozen of these episodes, with a short lecture by someone who's familiar with the topic at hand, and then a discussion based on comments on our YouTube chat. And so if you want to participate in today's discussion, just log on to YouTube and you can comment, and we will do our best to get to as many of the questions or comments that are in the chat. We've been doing several dozen of these political education talks, and we're not asking anybody for any money, but what we are asking you for is to like the video, to chat in the chat during the video, and to subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube page. We have a new print issue that has just been finished on coronavirus, timely topic, of course, which is available for purchase from the Jacobin website. And we would ask that you do purchase it if you have not yet done so. Not a lot of other socialist magazine issues dealing with the coronavirus response right now. And we have as well some forthcoming stay-at-home episodes, including Jeff Mann on Keynes and Keynesianism and the left, as well as our Europe editor, David Broder. He'll be talking about his piece in Catalyst on the rise and fall of Italian communism. And so do subscribe to our YouTube page so you get alerts when those future episodes are going to be happening. And tonight we are joined by Paul Prescod. Paul is a teacher in Philadelphia public schools. He is a member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, co-chair of the Philadelphia DSA Labor Committee, as well as a regular contributor to Jacobin. He had a piece just today up in Jacobin, Black Capitalism from Richard Nixon to Joe Biden. And as well, later this week, probably, either this week or next week, we'll have a piece up on our topic at hand today by Paul, which is on A. Phillip Randolph. And so we're going to have Paul talk for a little while about A. Phillip Randolph. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to turn it over to questions. And so again, if you've got questions for Paul, please put them in the YouTube chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. How's it going, Paul?
Good, Micah. Thanks. Thanks, Jacobin, for having me on and for doing this series. I know for me, it's definitely been a lifesaver from keeping me from boredom. I think it's been providing a lot of great political education. So the name A. Phillip Randolph, he usually conjures up this image of this kind of elder statesman, kind of a milquetoast figure of the civil rights movement establishment. And for some, even on the left, they think of him as a conservative influence in Black politics. Or at best, he's kind of mostly remembered for what took place at the very end of his political career. So today I want to challenge this perspective and assert that Randolph was actually one of the most consistently radical figures in Black politics and one of the greatest socialists of the 20th century. He's an absolute giant of our tradition, and his political life made an impact on almost every major development in Black politics from the 1920s to the 1970s. So from the first Union of Black Workers to the battles over Marcus Garvey's Black nationalism, to the desegregation of the armed forces, to the major strategies that would be used in the civil rights movements, to the debates over Black power, all of this Randolph had a major role to play. He commanded such overwhelming respect from Black activists of all stripes that even Malcolm X had to say, quote, "All civil rights leaders are confused, but Randolph is less confused than the rest." So I will try to go chronologically through his life. And in the process, I want to touch on 5 factors that made him especially important for socialists today. So 3 of these you can say are kind of organizational, and 2 of them are theoretical. So one is simply his incredible determination and long-term persistence. Socialists in the United States, we will not be able to achieve any of our political goals without this kind of long-term commitment and perspective. Second was the way he pioneered organizational methods and strategically used institutions. So he used his union as an organizational base for broader political struggles, and he chose to engage with and fight inside the major political institutions of American life rather than create separate ones. Third, when it came to organizing around racial justice, he followed the old organizing mantra, and that is choosing concrete issues that were widely and deeply felt. Theoretically, he had a commitment to a simple but powerful premise. You cannot separate civil rights from economic rights. If Black people are overwhelmingly working class, which they are, then it follows from this that building the labor movement and fighting for a far-reaching social democratic program is the best way for Black people to advance in this society. And lastly, he saw much earlier than others that the devastation that's been wrought on Black communities, especially since the second half of the 20th century, has been primarily caused by structural shifts in the economy and cannot be dealt with at the level of individual discrimination. So these are, and I hope by the end to convince you that he is in fact one of the most underrated socialists of our time. So let's start at the beginning. Asa Phillip Randolph was born 1889 in Florida. His father, James Randolph, was a minister at an African Methodist Episcopal church, and he saw the AME church as a militant social institution for Black people. And his father grew up surrounded by the Black political militancy of Reconstruction, and he transmitted a lot of that to his son. So from an early age, Randolph was encouraged to read. He was reading Shakespeare, and he was reading articles from Black political newspapers. He was brought up to revere men like Toussaint Louverture, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner. So you could say in a way he grew up with a sense of political possibility and racial pride. And so in 1905, Randolph hit a major development in his life. He was valedictorian of his class and kind of shaping up to be something of an intellectual. And that year he read W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, which he said was one of the most important books he ever read. So he came from a working class family, but he could see himself as possibly being part of the so-called talented 10th that Du Bois claimed would help Black people progress. And this raised a question that would be prevalent throughout his life, and that is, what is the role of Black intellectuals and the Black middle class in the struggle for civil and economic rights? But his family didn't have the means to send him to college, so that route was basically closed off to him. His other interest was acting. He had this great booming baritone voice, and in 1911, he set off to Harlem to try and make it as an actor. So his parents basically overruled that options, but what's really important here is that Randolph then got swept up in the political fervor of Harlem. And here is where he really worked out the political perspective that would guide him for the rest of his life. So he took classes at City College, started reading about Marx and socialism. And at this time, the socialist movement was enjoying kind of a brief moment of ascendancy. The radicals on his campus, they were talking about the industrial workers of the world. 1912, the year after he moved there, was the year Eugene Debs ran for president from prison and got 1 million votes. And this was the era in Harlem where you could go to all kinds of street corners and hear speakers, soap opera speakers of all political stripes. And in Marxism, Randolph felt he finally found an explanation for what caused intense competition between working people of different races. And he thought it was from this competition that discrimination and racial violence flowed from. And here is where he developed a belief that Black workers have to organize themselves in trade unions and whenever possible have to unite with white workers. And for the rest of his life, he never really wavered from this basic premise. And he saw it as his job to make this potential a reality. And so he threw himself into the left-wing activity of Harlem. He wasn't very good at keeping a job, and he failed at a lot of very early attempts to organize unions of Black workers, mainly hotel, elevator operators, and lumber workers. And there was really only one way he was able to live this kind of life. And unfortunately, I won't have time to get into his personal life, but his wife, Lucille Green, who was an associate of Madam C.J. Walker, owned a successful beauty parlor and basically subsidized his existence. And it was also through her he met a man named Chandler Owen, who would become his political partner in crime. Eventually, he and Chandler Owen were referred to as Lenin and Trotsky throughout Harlem. So both Owen and Randolph joined the Socialist Party in 1916, and they developed this great reputation as radical soapbox orators. And Randolph also started getting involved with socialist electoral efforts. But the major development for him during this time was starting the Messenger magazine with Chandler Owen. And for a while, the Messenger was the most radical Black political magazine in this country. And they tried to put more substance on this idea of the new Negro. So this idea that Black people had higher expectations now, they were not going to put up with the same kind of treatment anymore. And now this kind of vague militancy can go in many different directions, as it did with Garveyism, which we'll get to in a minute. But in the Messenger, they tried to direct this energy and militancy towards socialism and towards Black working class organization. And the magazine, they also tried to cultivate an anti-war sentiment among Black people and said, we have no stake in fighting in World War I. And this is where they got in trouble with the State Department, which labeled Randolph, quote, the most dangerous Negro in America at the time. Both he and Owen were arrested while talking to a mass meeting in Cleveland. They had a stroke of luck. The judge let them off because they just couldn't believe that Black people would be smart enough to write some of the things they were writing. And they thought it must be white socialists who are putting them up to this. So in the articles from these years, you see Randolph consistently promoting our Marxist understanding of all the different forms racial discrimination took, connecting them to the capitalist need for cheap labor and being heightened by phenomena like unemployment. And he really started to work out his view on the role of Black professionals and the Black middle class. And he launched some very provocative attacks. He ruthlessly criticized Du Bois for backing World War I, calling him, quote, a parlor socialist who no one in the streets would recognize as radical. But beyond individual attacks, he felt as a whole, this talented 10th was a conservative force. And he felt they were more interested in maintaining their own special status than narrowing the gap between them and the Black masses. And he said, I quote, I didn't feel there was the necessary racial and social and economic militancy of the talented 10th to give strength and force to the liberation of the Black masses. The 10th represented little more than a mere revolt against discrimination. They had no fighting force in them. So where real radicalism was concerned, they were like window dressing. And so in the 1920s, this is also where he has his major first confrontation with Black nationalism in the form of Marcus Garvey. And as I said at the beginning, Randolph maintained his working class political orientation his whole life, and he was never afraid to stick by it, even when it was unpopular. And Randolph actually introduced Garvey to the soapbox scene. Even though they had different approaches, at first they were pretty friendly, but very soon this became this very bitter personal rivalry. And so we should not forget that Garvey's movement was absolutely a mass movement that totally captured the imagination of Black people. Randolph admitted that Garvey organized more Black people than any other leader in the country's history. So Garvey's program was essentially the eventual return of all Black people to Africa to create their own empire and the building up of Black businesses. And he fused this very skillfully with this kind of militant racial and cultural pride. And given what was happening in the country at that time, it kind of makes sense that this movement would catch on. You had this huge wave of racial violence as Black troops returned from the war. You had riots, lynchings, Black workers being fired. Socialism did not really seem like a real prospect for Black people. There were no signs that Black people would be let inside the American Federation of Labor. And reflecting on this years later, Randolph said, quote, what you needed to follow Garvey was a leap of imagination. But socialism and trade unionism call for rigorous social struggle, hard work and programs. And few people wanted to think about that. Against the emotional power of Garveyism, what I was preaching didn't stand a chance. But Randolph thought Garvey's program was unrealistic, didn't have any class content, and basically he saw him as a charlatan. And when it got out that Garvey had this secret meeting with the Ku Klux Klan, this is when the feud got really bitter. Randolph started this Garvey Must Go campaign. He called him a, quote, a Jamaican jackass in one of his Messenger articles. And to show how intense this got, Randolph actually received a severed human hand in the mail, and he suspects that it was from Marcus Garvey. So all of this not only gave Randolph experience in fighting Black nationalism, but it was revealing. And here he saw that his instincts about the Garvey movement were confirmed. So despite the incredible enthusiasm it generated, which again yielded actual organization, it petered out and it was just not viable. But even so, Randolph, he was also out of step with actually existing Black politics. The American Federation of Labor still excluded Black workers. Socialism seemed dead, especially when you factor in the post-World War I repression of the left. And by 1925, the Messenger had declined, and not one of his unions or organizations that Randolph started had survived by then. So this is where he has a stroke of luck. Randolph was approached by a Pullman car porter that read the Messenger, who wanted him to help them organize a union. So the Pullman company, they owned these luxury dining cars, and Blacks worked as porters that tended to the needs of the passengers on the cars. And it was considered one of the better jobs Black people could get, but in many ways, it was also a demeaning job. They had to scramble for tips. The passengers called all the Black workers George, which was after the owner of the company, George Pullman. And the Pullman company was so powerful, it was very hard to imagine Black workers could ever organize there. And they had actually beat back previous attempts to organize. So Randolph, he hesitated at first, but he had a really big personal and political stake in this. This would really be his last chance to make it as an organizer. If he failed this, he would remain an intellectual. But more importantly, this was he thought his last chance to prove that the labor movement was a way for Blacks to advance. And with the porters, it wasn't just about economics, it was about dignity. So he accepted the offer, and in 1925, he founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And from now on, I'll refer to the union as the Brotherhood. So in the beginning, I mentioned his tireless determination, persistence, and with the struggles with the porters, you can really see this. It took 12 years to organize the porters into a union. Now I'll repeat that, 12 years. The company had three main weapons they used against the drive: worker spies, layoffs, the threats of layoffs, and anti-union elements within Black institutions. The spies were so effective that the union, they had to operate in secret. At the first meeting, Randolph, he did all the talking, so no worker could be identified as being part of the movement. You had the dean of Howard University coming out against Black unionism. Most Black churches wouldn't let speakers from the union use their platform, and a lot of Black newspapers attacked the effort, and George Pullman made sure that every Black worker had these newspapers readily available to them. There was an initial wave of enthusiasm, but during the Depression, things got so bad that the union went from a membership of 7,000 in 1928 to 770 in 1932. And you can read about just heartbreaking stories of people's lives being destroyed by sacrificing for the union. Wives leaving them, people being evicted, having to pawn off things. Randolph often, to get to the next city, he had to pass the hat, didn't really have soles in his shoes, stuff like that. But they get an opening with the New Deal. And this, of course, re-energized the labor movement, including the porters. And it also made a lasting impression on Randolph about the opportunities that could be opened up by the federal government. So when they finally get to the election between the company union and the Brotherhood, they win by a margin of 7,000 votes. And in this last-ditch effort, the Pullman company sent Randolph a blank check and said, you can fill it in any 6-digit figure if you drop the campaign, which Randolph, of course, refused to do. So in August 1937, exactly 12 years after the union was formed, they got an agreement. So they reduced the work month from 400 hours to 240, and he almost doubled the porter's wages. But more importantly, they won dignity, and he proved that Black workers could unionize against all odds, and that this was concretely the most viable way forward. So Randolph, he did the impossible, and overnight he became one of the most important Black union and political leaders in the country. I'm going to skip over a little bit, but what he did with this union was innovative, and I think it's a model we should seriously think about on the left today. So he saw his union, the Brotherhood, as the home base of operations for building a broader political movement. And everything he did was anchored in this base, and he used its human and financial resources, and they were leveraged for other political work. And there's no better example of this than the March on Washington movement of the 1940s. which I think is one of the most incredible and underrated movements of American history. So as we transitioned to a war economy in preparation for World War II, Randolph basically had one thing on his mind. He wanted to make sure Black workers seize on this opportunity to get good employment in the defense industries and to desegregate the armed forces. Black workers were caught in a bind. Employers wouldn't hire people, and the excuse was they needed the training, and unions mostly refused to give Black workers the trainings or the opportunity for a union card. So Randolph saw an opportunity here, and he starts with his base. So at the 1940 Brotherhood Convention, which had Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, of course, in the audience, they passed a resolution calling on the president to end segregation in the armed forces. And so the idea for a march came while he was on a train with his top general in the Union, Milton Webster. And they were sitting around, and he said, what if we get 10,000 Black people to march on DC demanding fair employment? And Webster responded, well, of course, that'd be great, but where the hell are we going to find 10,000 Black people to do that? So they then used the infrastructure of the Union to promote the march. So he toured around to all the Brotherhood locals, talking about it to the members. The porters themselves, of course, traveled for work, so they spread the word wherever they went. And this was partly a game of strategic bluffing. They really had no idea they could get 1,000 people, let alone 10,000 people to march. But they knew they at least had to make the government think that this was a credible threat and that there was actual momentum for it. And Randolph knew the timing could work in his favor because the government is not going to want a mass march just as they're about to enter a major war. And so it was an incredibly bold plan, and there really was no precedent for it. And the way the organizing happened signaled a different kind of politics. This was not a movement predicated on the direction of middle-class leaders or mobilizing the intellectuals. This was a movement that was directly organizing and mobilizing working-class Black America. So Randolph and the Brotherhood, they campaigned in bars, in union halls, in barbershops, in salons, in movie theaters, in pool rooms, anywhere where Black people actually lived and worked. And the momentum drew in the other mainstream civil rights organizations that did not want to be outflanked. So the sponsoring committee or the coordinating committee of the movement included the NAACP, the Urban League, and figures like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. But still, these other groups didn't really throw their weight behind the march. It was mostly the Brotherhood that funded its activities. So they had mass rallies of 10,000 and 20,000 Black people in major cities. It was really an astonishing expression of militance. And now this was a very real thing. And people started speculating that maybe even 100,000 people would come out to march. And Lester Granger of the Urban League said, quote, "It was Randolph's immense prestige among all classes of Negroes that made this idea something more than a pretentious notion." And more importantly, the government saw this was a real threat they couldn't ignore. So Randolph was brought into the White House to negotiate with FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. And these were very legendary sessions. They asked him, where are people going to sleep? Where are they going to eat? What about violence? And Randolph simply said, this is your job to figure out. There's only going to be violence if the police attack the demonstrators. But I can't call off this march until I get something in writing. So I think we have a short video here about Randolph talking about these negotiations.
Concern grew over the prospect of thousands of Black Americans marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. President Roosevelt asked Randolph to come to the White House.
The president made as his first comment, he said, Phil Randolph, we can't have 100,000 Negroes marching on Washington. If anything such as that were to occur, you wouldn't be able to manage them. We might have bloodshed and death. He said, now let us get on to business here and find out what can be done. So I said, well, Mr. President, what we're concerned about is jobs. Jobs in the munition industries, and we want to abolish discrimination against Negroes in the government, where there are many jobs. And he said, you indicating that the government discriminates against Negroes? Look, I said, it's one of the worst offenders. We talked at length, and finally he said that, what do you want me to do? I said, we want you to issue an executive order abolishing discrimination in munition jobs and also in the government.
Roosevelt gave in. He blinked first, and he issued Executive Order 0082, which created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or FEPC, to prevent discrimination of Black workers in the defense industry. So yet again, Randolph pulled off a pretty stunning victory. And of course, the victory had its limits. The FEPC, wasn't well funded or well staffed. It was very hard to enforce. And, the other big demand of desegregating the military was not part of it. But still, this was a huge achievement that changed the lives of many Black workers. And so Randolph called off the march, even though not all these demands were met. And this was a controversial decision. Bayard Rustin, who was part of the youth wing of the movement, of course, would later become one of his biggest associates, denounced Randolph for this. And of course, this is one of those tough tactical decisions that's very easy to denounce after the fact, but much more complicated if you're the one actually making the decision. But also importantly, the March on Washington movement was kept as an organization to police the executive order. And here's where we see some really interesting organizing that I think foreshadowed the tactics that would be used during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And again, it was not surprising that the movement was at its strongest where there were also strong brotherhood union chapters. So I think St. Louis is the best example of the movement. They would have weekly meetings that turned out several hundred people. They led a silent march of 500 people around a munitions factory. And that same day, the company raised the wages of the Black workers of the company, and they hired 72 new Black women in the company. Again, think about the context of the 40s. That's a huge victory. They did sit-ins and other kinds of civil disobedience at employers that weren't hiring Black workers. But the summer of 1942 was really the peak of the movement's popularity and influence. You had mass rallies being held in major cities promoting not just the fair employment issues, but things like anti-lynching, anti-poll legislation. But the crown of it all was in June of that year, where Randolph staged a rally in Madison Square Garden with 18,000 people. And this was a 5-hour spectacle that had big-name speakers, music, political skits. Randolph was escorted in by 20 porters in uniform with a band playing the union's theme song. It was the center of gravity of Black political activity. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. used that event to announce his run to be Harlem's first Black congressional representative. And Harlem did a blackout where they blacked out all the lights in honor of the event. And people said they had never seen anything like it since the rallies of Marcus Garvey. And just like Garvey in the 20s, Randolph and this movement had really captured the imaginations, the hearts and minds of working class Blacks. And it provided a different model of doing Black politics. But he did not forget about the demand to desegregate the armed forces. So as Truman was gearing up for the Korean War, he was also gearing up for the election of 1948, where he knew Black votes would be crucial. So again, Randolph gathered his forces and he got a meeting in the White House. And again, he had a very militant negotiating style. He said, Black people are not willing to fight in a Jim Crow army. And I will personally promote people resisting the draft, even if that means I go to jail. And he knew this was a popular position. He led pickets at the 1948 DNC about it. And again, Truman saw this is a credible threat. He can back it up. And he issued Executive Order 9981, which called for the armed services to be desegregated. So in both the Fair Employment and the Armed Services campaign, we see that they were successful because they were concrete, the issues were widely and deeply felt, and they were strategically timed. And this is how Randolph approached racial justice struggles, and I think we need to as well. You can't wage a campaign, I think, against an abstract thing called racism or an abstract thing called white supremacy, even though we know they exist. So when it comes to issues like reparations, for example, we need to think, is there a broad enough base we can mobilize around this issue that feels it in a concrete way? So the union would continue to play this role of organizational anchor in the civil rights movement. And I think some people notice when Rosa Parks was arrested, the first call she made was to E.D. Nixon, who was the president of the Brotherhood chapter in Alabama. And he proceeded to organize the beginnings, along with others, of course, of the bus boycott. And Nixon said that without Randolph teaching him the skills, he would not have known what to do next. Randolph sent funds to the local for the boycott campaign. And a lot of their meetings were held in the Brotherhood Union Hall. Randolph continued to fight tirelessly against racial discrimination inside the AFL. which I think also says a lot about his political perspective. It would be totally understandable for him to give up on the AFL. But he thought the only way improvements on race could be made was if he was inside it fighting for it. So every convention, he would get up to talk about dealing with segregated locals, and every time he would be ignored. His union did not yield much influence. They didn't really have a big membership, but I think he was a moral voice on this issue. And I think he laid the basis for the support, however inadequate, that would come later from the AFL-CIO on the civil rights movement. And this is another thing for us to think about in the left today. There are certain institutions of working people on the left, like unions, that we can't give up on. And we need to really make strategic decisions on how we relate to them. So now let's look at the moment Phillip Randolph usually is remembered for, even though this happened when he was already in his 70s, which is the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So although Rustin was the main logistical organizer, it couldn't have happened without Randolph. And I think you can see the march has his name written all over it. When you look at pictures and video of the march, of the picket signs, you can see, demands for full employment, demands to raise the minimum wage, a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. Only Randolph had the respect and the prestige to bring together all the leaders of the different civil rights groups, who I'm sure you can imagine had massive egos and massive rivalries between them. And he had the relationships within the labor movement to make it happen. And this is, I think, probably the most important part of it. So of course the march was intended to pressure the government on the Civil Rights Act. But for Randolph, it also signaled a pivot towards a new stage in the movement. Rustin, and I think to a lesser extent MLK, realized something a lot earlier than others. And they saw that after the legal pillars of Jim Crow were struck down, the movement had to take on broader social and economic goals. And ironically, I think Randolph and Black Power activists actually agreed on something. They both agreed that the civil rights movement in the South cannot deal with the problems Black people were facing in northern ghettos. But of course, they had different strategies for solving these problems. Randolph saw that there were structural changes in the economy creating this crisis situation. These were issues of jobs, housing, healthcare, and education. He constantly talked about automation because he realized that the first jobs to go are unskilled or semi-skilled jobs, and these are the jobs that Black workers are in disproportionately. So therefore, the struggle for civil rights had to also be tied in with problems of political economy. So I'll quote him a little bit at length on this, but he said, "The problem of racial discrimination is not the reason why our society tolerates a high degree of unemployment and is willing to increase unemployment to combat inflation. Nor is it the reason why we do not build enough decent housing for everybody. These problems will not be solved simply by changing the racial attitudes of whites. They are fundamentally economic problems which are caused by the nature of the system in which we live. This system is a market economy in which investment and production are determined more by the anticipation of profits than by the desire to achieve social justice." So in this context, he and Bayard Rustin, through the A. Phillip Randolph Institute, put forward the Freedom Budget as a vision of where the movement needed to go. And this was a comprehensive program of full employment, housing to eradicate slums, raising the minimum wage, national health care, and upgrading Social Security. It represented nothing less than at least a social democratic transformation of the country. It was the proposal truly up to the task of addressing the issues workers of all races were facing, and it was the inverse of the concept of community control and going local. It's a longer story. Sadly, the Vietnam War and other political factors prevented this from being enacted. But what's interesting here, and I'll be finishing it up shortly, what's interesting is that it was during this period when Randolph was promoting the Freedom Budget that he was described as a moderate, and Black Power was seen as radical. And we have a perfect test case to look at this. We can look at the program and the demands coming out of the Black Power conferences of the middle and late 60s. And I think a lot of these really cannot be described as radical. You had demands for neighborhood credit unions, more Black businesses, Buy Black campaigns, the creation of Black nonprofits. And many of them are perfectly fine. But if you put that up against Randolph's transformative agenda, it's pretty clear to me which one is more radical and which one would actually distribute wealth and resources and power more. But despite this, in the 60s, many younger Black Power activists and Black nationalists thought Randolph was too moderate. He never bought into the idea of community control because he thought it was too easily adopted for conservatives. And he spent his whole political career fighting against Southern racists who always use the argument of states' rights and local control to block any progress for Black people. And he also strongly believed that the fundamental problems could only be solved at the federal level, and that going local through community control was not the way to go. But still, he remained a connective tissue for different civil rights figures and organizations. He always defended the right of Black nationalists to express their views, and he gave them credit for giving Americans a greater sense of urgency about racial problems. And one of my favorite pictures, I think, is going to be displayed is Malcolm X sharing a platform with Randolph, supporting a strike by Hospital Workers Union 1199. And I think it's a great example that if there was one person that could get Malcolm X support working class union activity, it was Randolph. He had that kind of prestige and respect, even among those that disagreed with him. So, there are things we can criticize about his later political activity. He didn't take a strong stand against the war. He wasn't for it, but he didn't take a strong stand against it. And he didn't think civil rights organizations should really involve themselves with it. I think many of us on the left would disagree with that. And maybe at the end of his life, there was too much inside strategy and maybe not enough outside strategy. But nonetheless, I hope I made the case today that not only is A. Phillip Randolph one of the most consistently radical figures in American politics, I think his political and organizational genius make him the most relevant for the left today. So I'll end it there and we can open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So again, if you've got questions, we have a couple that are in the chat already, but please, if you have any other questions, put them in the YouTube chat. And I'm going to start with a couple of my own, Paul. You mentioned in the beginning Randolph's belief that was established at an early age when he was first politicized, that the Black middle class, the kind of talented 10th, was a conservative force in Black life, and that obviously was why he oriented himself towards the working class, the multiracial working class, but obviously especially the Black working class as a Black trade union leader. Do you think that orientation is tied to his rejection of Garveyism and his rejection of Black nationalism? Did he see that kind of Black nationalism as some kind of an expression of that kind of talented 10th portion of Black Americans, rather than speaking to the aspirations and the material needs of the Black masses and to the broader working class as a whole that he clearly saw as like the change agent to bring about progressive change in society?
Yeah, and I think he saw it as an expression of the interests of that class or stratum. The idea of like promoting more Black businesses, of course, is going to benefit a certain stratum. But he didn't deny that. Many working class Black people were very caught up in Garveyism and motivated by it. And he was practical in the sense that he would never deny, the support of whether it's middle class organizations or individuals to a working class cause. But I think partly he saw Garveyism as, despite the enthusiasm it's generating, it's not really moving forward a program that's practical or really in the interests of Black working people. I hope that answers.
Yeah, and obviously that question, like you could ask that question, a similar question of contemporary racial justice organizing, contemporary left organizing, contemporary union organizing. I think that question can be that is like at the heart of several questions we could ask about organizing today. Olivia Harding on the chat asks, did the movement Randolph led have to explicitly contrast itself with Garvey's ideas, or did these ideological conflicts fall by the wayside as the Brotherhood organized workers? And so could you answer that, both that specific question and maybe speak to what this has to tell us about organizing in the 21st century?
Yeah, well, so during the time of Garveyism, Randolph didn't really have a movement. So when he was organizing the Porters, that was kind of when Garveyism was on its decline. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sorry, I'm asking you a complicated multi-part question. I mean, it's basically about the question from the chat is, did there have to be such explicit conflict between the kind of nationalist impulses that Garvey was organizing around versus what Randolph was organizing for? And then my question is that the same today? Are there those kind of impulses that Randolph probably today would think, whether they're nationalist or some other expression of Black organizing or racial justice organizing today, that Randolph would say, no, that's the wrong way to go about the organizing that we need to be doing in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, he was very clear, and I mean, you could imagine the scene, but I mean, these were the days of soapbox preaching. So he was always very clear, trying to say that, what we need to do is socialism instead of nationalism, working class organization instead of what Garvey has to offer. And I think he would say it has to be clear. We can't necessarily fall into this, well, let's just do anything and everything and all of the above, because they really are very distinct agendas to be saying we want to, for example, support the growth of Black businesses or Black small businesses. That's a very distinct agenda to we want to build up unions. Or social democratic policy. So you can't kind of lump them together and say, well, this is all helping Black people. There's cleavages there that we need to point out specifically.
A question that's come up a couple times that is probably an indication that you've done given an engaging talk, is that people want to know a little bit more about where they can learn about A. Phillip Randolph. Well, quickly, do you have any mentions for good resources for more on this topic besides your own article that's coming out?
Oh yeah, right. Soon. Of course, my article, the be all and end all. But yeah, there are a few books. I mean, there's one book called For Jobs and Freedom, which is a collection of his speeches and writings. Robert Jervis, I might be getting the name wrong, is bad, but wrote a biography. It's called A. Phillip Randolph, a biographical sketch. That's very good. The clip there was from a documentary that's on YouTube. It's actually quite good. It's like a PBS thing from the 90s. And there's actually an interesting movie called 10,000 Black Men Named George. It's kind of like a B-rate Hollywood movie, but it's actually pretty good and fairly historically accurate about the Brotherhood. And that one you can watch free on YouTube.
We have Shannon M. asking about how you feel about the USPS, the United States Postal Service. And you've written about the Postal Service before for Jacobin, and written about the Postal Service as a kind of engine of uplift for African Americans in the United States. So can you talk about the USPS and the sort of relation to the kind of stuff that we've been talking about what A. Phillip Randolph was organizing for his whole life?
Yeah, people in Philly know I'm the #1 promoter of the USPS. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of all the things we're talking about federal employment, unionized employment, and public programs overwhelming and disproportionately benefiting Black Americans. So, I think roughly 25%, maybe a little more, of postal worker employees are African American, and this represents a very stable living wage job that people can depend on. And again, this is even more important for Black workers who are in a more precarious situation. And it's one of those examples of, it doesn't sound necessarily like an anti-racist thing to be defending the post office, but I think that would have more impact than so many other things. And it's a irrefutable fact that the greatest factor historically that has mitigated Black poverty has been federal employment and public sector employment. That it's just a fact of life. So something like that is crucial. And even think about something like postal banking, which would end this sort of thing where, payday lenders and loan sharks, which are preying more, I think, on communities of color. Something like postal banking would expand employment and provide more employment for Black workers, and also end this predatory situation that's taking place in many Black communities.
Yeah, that sounds related to what you were saying near the end of your talk about how we can't wage an abstract campaign for racial justice, that it has to have policies like that, you're not just fighting white supremacy, you're saying like here's a postal bank that will provide services in Black communities and predatory lending, and the postal service that will be an engine of uplift for large numbers of Black people. I guess besides defending the post office, what else is sort of the Randolphian agenda for the 21st century? Whether within the labor movement or any other way you want to answer it, with the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, what does A. Phillip Randolph have to say about all these developments?
I'm probably going to offer a very boring and non-innovative answer, but so one, obviously with the labor movement, today Black workers are actually more likely to be members of unions than workers of other races. So, and they're disproportionately concentrated in the public sector. So defending the public sector, and we know austerity is coming, is going to be crucial. And of course, we're talking about, services that disproportionately affect communities of color, such as public education, public employment, and things like that. So waging, and again, this is talking about concrete issues, not something abstract to wage campaigns around. So building the labor movement and campaigning for, I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was basically the freedom budget. That's what it was. And so I think he would agree, like, we got to throw ourselves behind those kinds of proposals, but also at the same time, and this is why I mentioned his relation to the AFL-CIO, we have to be smart and tactical. He more than anyone else had reason to hate the AFL-CIO and give up on them. And many leftists, there's plenty to be frustrated about the labor movement about, but we need to figure out how are we going to work intelligently within the labor movement and deal with elements we may not like. So how are we going to navigate all of that to move forward productively? And that's probably the hardest, most complicated question, where there's not an easy answer, or there's not a script that you can just go to that's kind of worked out through experience.
Question from Kenny in the chat. What do you think accounts for the relative lack of knowledge about / enthusiasm for A. Phillip Randolph compared to other Black intellectuals and organizers?
I think maybe on one hand, Randolph himself was very, he wasn't out to grab headlines and stuff like that. But yeah, I think his story does not tell the story that they want to tell about the civil rights movement. And including, I think today, what people on the right within Black America want to tell about, if you keep the movement within the confines of ending discrimination, which of course is necessary, then that is kind of making the argument that it's okay to just have a new stratum of Black elected officials or Black capitalists and stuff like that. So if you remove that one barrier, that kind of keeps a capitalist logic in place. So I think Randolph's story of, before what we consider the modern civil rights movement, how much labor, really influenced that. I think, Black pundits today who are against Bernie, I think they'd be very uncomfortable having to justify how they were against the labor movement if they were forced to acknowledge that the labor movement was absolutely crucial for the civil rights movement. That would put them in a very uncomfortable position. Maybe some of them just truly don't even know it. But I think the narrative that excludes Randolph, I think suits people's purposes today more.
Question that I have, you mentioned that he kind of fell out of favor with when the civil rights movement shifted towards Black power, and you mentioned Bayard Rustin, who of course was one of the organizers of the March on Washington with him. And in 1968, in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and Brooklyn, there were these famous acrimonious teacher strikes that essentially pitted a mostly white teachers union against Black and Latino parents and community members who are struggling over community control. And I read a book on that strike, and there's this picture of Bayard Rustin there at a rally for the teachers union. And if you look at the photo, it's like a zoomed out photo of the crowd, and Bayard Rustin is clearly the only Black face in the crowd, versus the parents and the community members who are mostly Black and Latino. And so looking at that photo, I was in many ways sympathetic to what Rustin was arguing for, but it also just seems summed up in that photo, that Rustin was kind of out of step with where the Black movement was in that moment in 1968. Or at least it felt that way just from looking at the photo. So my question is, do you have kind of reflection on that? I mean, like, A. Phillip Randolph can have the correct positions in his historical moment, but does it matter that he's out of step with where the Black movement is? Is there some way how he can sort of bridge that gap without alienating people? I mean, you were talking about some really acerbic polemics that he had against Marcus Garvey, and I assume that was not building any bridges. So how do you deal with that sense of like the Black movement being in one place historically, and someone like A. Phillip Randolph not being in that same place, not being in agreement with that movement? Does that matter? How do you overcome that problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was hoping someone would bring at Ocean Hill-Brownsville, because I didn't really have time to get to it. And that's a really tough question. And of course, I'm sitting here in 2020 doing the ultimate Monday morning quarterbacking on it. I think, so I kind of lost my train of thought here, but I mean, so for one, in a lot of their writings and when they spoke, Randolph and Rustin, I mean, they were actually pretty level-headed about acknowledging when they were out of step and why that was the case, and being very understanding about it. Because so often a lot of people kind of don't realize this, but like Rustin and Randolph would say, like, I totally understand why Malcolm X is so appealing to people, or other Black nationalists. And he said it's also partly a failure of us and the labor movement to really capture the imagination of working class people that are being caught up with this. So they would acknowledge, they understood where this stuff was coming from. And with that situation, one thing I will say, and again, it's very easy to say this in hindsight, when asked about Ocean Hill-Brownsville, Randolph basically said, like, look, this is an issue about due process. This community control board wants to remove mostly white teachers without due process. As a union person, I can't agree with this. I don't think it was a problem for him to say that, but it comes off either naive or tone deaf to say this is an issue about job security and not race. And I don't think that means he had to change his position. But I think in the way you talk about it, you kind of have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And they did try to work relationships. So at first they actually had a letter supporting the teachers that was signed by many Black unionists. A lot of them backed out. I mean, honestly, not because they didn't agree with them, but they felt so much heat from a base that was mostly Black to back away from that letter. So I really didn't offer up an answer. It's a very tricky situation, but I think rhetorically in that sense, like, you can say to your position without ignoring the elephant in the room.
A quick historical question by Shirley. Did A. Phillip Randolph have any relationship with Hubert Harrison? I believe we recently ran an article in Jacobin about Hubert Harrison. And then maybe you can also answer that question along with the question from Marina Durano. Can you say who among the socialist writers inspired Randolph's thinking in developing his programs and his political strategies? I know you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, but I assume there's others too you can mention there.
Yeah. Personally, I actually don't know too much about Hubert Harrison, but yeah, he was part of that kind of early cohort of radicals in Harlem, who he was very enthusiastic about. And they worked together in the Socialist Party for a while. Hubert Harrison would eventually leave the Socialist Party, and he kind of moved away from that politics. And yeah, I mean, the biggest inspiration for Randolph, like many others, was Eugene Debs, who's kind of universally acknowledged as one of the most inspirational socialists of the time. He had some professors at City College that influenced him, but it was really Debs who would, come by New York a lot to speak, and reading Marx and other socialists that got him inspired.
Another question from Marina Durano. Can you elaborate on the socialist content of Randolph's program and anything on worker control of the state, for example, and how that was to be achieved?
So a lot of Randolph's earlier writings, especially with The Messenger, were more radical in terms of, he was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution. So in that era, he was, really talking about a workers' revolution and workers' control of the state. And even all the way up until the 40s and 50s, he was advocating for, whether it was third parties or a socialist party. And I think eventually it wasn't because he loved the Democrats that he stopped advocating. He just didn't really see it as viable later on in life. You could say, yes, he maybe got more moderate as time went on. But again, it's kind of like today. It's like, to me, there's no point in quibbling over Bernie being a social democrat. He is, and I think that is extremely radical in the American context. And that's kind of where we're at today in terms of trying to get. So I think by the end of his life, he was a social democrat. Earlier on, he was advocating maybe more radical measures, but I think he was sort of just adjusting pragmatically.
Can you talk about, obviously we can see pretty easily, like the post office, for example, their unions represent large numbers of Black workers and fight for better pay and better benefits and due process and everything that unions do for Black workers. And, that's pretty obvious how unions can benefit Black workers. But what about Randolph's orientation towards the working class as a whole? Because I assume the whole reason why he stuck it out in the AFL-CIO through really tough times was not just because he wanted to advocate for Black workers and Black union members, but because he saw the entire working class as the agent of change in society, right? And then so to win for Black people, he would have to be a part of a labor movement that represented more than just Black workers, that represented workers of all colors.
Right. Yeah, and he understood, the need to get to a majority to get through any civil rights measures, and also labor movement institutionally for its resources. So like he, affiliated the porters early on with the AFL, and the main reason he did that is because like they have the necessary resources that can help us right now. If we don't do this, we're pretty much we're screwed. And he also again recognized, however inadequate it was, the AFL-CIO and different unions like the UAW like really provided crucial support to so many initiatives in the civil rights movement. So he saw there's really nowhere else to go to get this kind of institutional support, and just the overall idea that we need a majoritarian movement in order to achieve our goals. Like we just simply can't do it if we're isolated.
Great. Well, I think we will end it there. There's a lot of questions in the chat, but Paul's given some suggestions for where you can go read and watch more about A. Phillip Randolph, and as we already mentioned, his own article soon coming out in Jacobin will be one of those places. So thank you to everyone for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the Jacobin channel. And as well, don't forget that we have our new issue out now on coronavirus and socialist response to it. And Paul, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about A. Phillip Randolph.
Thanks for having me.